If someone you love asks for space, you imagine it will be temporary, maybe even healthy for the relationship. That's what I thought when my wife demanded a month apart. But on the 31st day, when she called me crying, I wasn't the same man she'd left. I had already moved on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I look back on that moment now, it feels like the exact second my life split into two separate paths, the man I used to be and the man I've become. My name is Malcolm, and for most of my adult life, I've believed in steady routines, loyalty, and the kind of trust that doesn't falter even under pressure. I wasn't the most exciting husband, perhaps, but I was the kind who showed up. I took care of responsibilities, I supported dreams that weren't mine, and I thought that was what a marriage was supposed to be built on. Yet, when my wife Clara looked at me across our kitchen table one gray morning in March and said she needed a month to breathe, all of that belief started to crack. The words didn't sound like oxygen to me. They sounded like a death sentence waiting in disguise. I didn't explode, though. That wasn't who I was. I remember staring at her, trying to figure out if she was serious or if this was some strange test. Clara had always been expressive, dramatic even, but not like this. She was sitting there with her arms folded, eyes darting everywhere but me, and her voice was colder than I had ever heard it. I asked her what space meant. She said she needed time away from me to figure out what she really wanted. A month. 30 days. No communication, no questions, just silence. She promised it wasn't about another man, though she rushed to clarify that so quickly it only made me doubt her words. Still, what could I do? Beg her to stay? Chain her to the house? That's not love. Love is supposed to be free, right? The first night after she left was the worst. Our home in Brookfield had never felt so enormous and yet so empty. I sat on the couch with a plate of untouched food, staring at the muted television screen as if answers might suddenly crawl out of it. I thought about our wedding, about how we'd promised forever in front of friends and family, and wondered how forever had started to shrink into a countdown. By the third night, I was pacing the halls like a restless ghost, opening drawers she used, smelling her perfume on the sweaters she left behind, clinging to traces of someone who had chosen absence over presence. I didn't tell many people at first. Pride has a funny way of making silence seem easier than explanation, but my younger sister Diane noticed something was wrong. She came by with groceries one evening, and when I couldn't hold back the truth, she just stared at me like I'd announced a death in the family. "Malcolm," she whispered, "that doesn't sound like space. That sounds like she's trying to live without you." Her words stung, but I wasn't ready to believe them. Not yet. I still clung to the hope that Clara would walk back through the door after 30 days, and everything would reset. Like a movie where the conflict exists only to make the reunion sweeter. But deep down, my chest told me otherwise. Every morning I woke up to the side of the bed that stayed cold. Every evening I ate in silence. And every night I stared at the ceiling as questions ate me alive. Why 30 days? Why not a weekend? Or a week? What was she really doing during that time? And why did I feel like I had been put on probation for crimes I hadn't even committed? Still, I followed her rules. No texts, no calls, no emails. I marked the calendar like a prisoner scratching days on a cell wall. I told myself, 1 month and then we'll know. Either she'll come back and we'll fix it, or she won't. But as the days crawled forward, I didn't realize that this so-called space she demanded wasn't just giving her room to breathe. It was forcing me to see who I was when she wasn't around. And that revelation was going to change everything. What I didn't know then was that the 31st day wouldn't bring the relief I'd imagined. It would bring Clara's sobbing voice through the phone, desperate and broken, asking for a man who no longer existed. Because by then, I had already stepped onto a new path. By then, I had already moved on. Before everything unraveled, my life had a rhythm that felt almost unshakable. I was 42 years old, a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm in Brookfield, a job that demanded long hours and a clear head. My mornings began before the sun rose. Black coffee in a chipped mug I'd owned since college, a 20-minute jog around the neighborhood, and a quick shower before heading into the office. By 8 o'clock, I was already buried in blueprints, schedules, and client calls. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. And steady was the kind of man I had always aimed to be. My colleagues knew me as the reliable one, the person who would cover shifts, troubleshoot problems, and stay until midnight if a deadline demanded it. That stability carried over into the way I lived at home too. Bills were always paid on time, groceries stocked, cars maintained. Clara had once told me that my steadiness was what drew her in when we met 7 years ago at a friend's birthday dinner. She said I felt like an anchor, something solid in a world full of people chasing fleeting thrills. She was right about that. Clara, by contrast, was a whirlwind. She taught art classes at a local community center, spent her weekends dabbling in new hobbies, and had an energy that filled every room she entered. Where I was methodical and predictable, she was spontaneous and wild, and for a long time I believed that balance was our strength. I handled the logistics of life, and she made sure it was painted in color. Our house reflected that same balance. The walls were hung with her canvases, abstract splashes of paint that I didn't always understand but admired because they were hers. My influence was in the neatly organized bookshelves, the meticulously labeled storage bins in the garage, the calendar stuck to the fridge with all our appointments neatly penned in. Friends often joked that we were proof that opposites attract, and for years, I held on to that as a kind of badge of honor. I was proud to be a husband who provided stability, who made sure Clara had the freedom to chase her passions without worrying about whether the lights would stay on or whether we could afford groceries. She would spend hours experimenting with watercolors or ceramics while I quietly calculated budgets and reviewed project timelines. I told myself this was love. Two people carving out space for each other to thrive in their own ways. But if I'm honest, there were cracks in that picture long before the morning she asked for space. Clara had always hinted that she wanted more adventure in our lives. She'd bring up spontaneous road trips, late-night concerts, or even the idea of moving to a different city. I would nod, smile, and promise we'd plan something when work slowed down. But work never really slowed down. It felt like life was always pushing us forward, and I assumed she understood that stability sometimes required sacrifice. I thought the dinners I cooked when she was too tired, the flowers I brought home on random Fridays, and the quiet weekends we spent on the couch were enough to show her I cared. To me, normal life was sacred. To Clara, it might have been suffocating. Still, she never used those words. She smiled at our friends, held my hand in public, kissed me goodnight, and told me she loved me every morning before I left for work. So when she sat at the kitchen table that March morning and asked for 30 days apart, it didn't match the picture I had of us. It felt like being blindsided by a storm on a clear day. The strange part is, I wasn't the kind of man who ignored problems. At work, I tackled them head-on. If a project went off track, I was the one to roll up my sleeves and sort out the mess. But in marriage, I had taken a different approach. I believed in patience, in letting things smooth themselves out over time. If Clara seemed restless, I told myself it was just a phase. If she seemed distant, I thought she'd come around after a good night's sleep. I trusted the foundation we had built, maybe too much, assuming it could withstand anything without me needing to fight for it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Looking back, that passivity was my blind spot. I assumed my steadiness was enough, when in reality, Clara may have been waiting for me to meet her halfway, to take risks, to chase adventures with her, to show her that life with me wasn't just dependable, but alive. I didn't see it then. I only saw the version of myself I'd always been. A man who believed love was proven in the quiet, consistent things, not the grand gestures. That's why her request cut so deeply. It wasn't just about needing space. It felt like a rejection of the very qualities I thought made me a good husband. If steadiness, loyalty, and reliability weren't enough, then what was? And if she needed time away to even decide if she wanted this marriage, then perhaps the ground we stood on wasn't as solid as I'd always imagined. So as I sat alone in our house during those early days of her absence, surrounded by the traces of the life we had built, I began to question not only our marriage but also my own identity. Who was I outside of being the steady provider, the patient husband, the man who kept everything running smoothly? If Clara couldn't see value in that, then maybe I needed to ask myself whether I had been living too small, too safe. At the time, I didn't have answers. All I had was silence, a house full of reminders, and a 30-day countdown hanging over me like a sentence I hadn't deserved. The beginning of our story felt nothing like the ending that would eventually unfold. I can still remember the first night I met Clara as if it had been etched into my memory in bold ink. It was late spring, and my friend Mark had convinced me to attend his birthday dinner at a lively Italian restaurant downtown. I wasn't much of a social butterfly. I usually kept my circle small, preferring quiet evenings over crowded tables. But that night, something pushed me to go, maybe just to prove to myself that I could step outside the boundaries of my routine. Clara was seated across the table, laughing so freely that it turned heads from nearby diners. She wore a red scarf even though the night was warm, and I remember thinking she looked like someone who didn't just move through life but danced through it. I spent most of the evening listening, watching her gesture wildly as she told stories about her students at the Community Arts Center. Her passion spilled into every word, and even though I barely spoke to her directly that night, something inside me shifted. I wasn't used to being drawn in so quickly, but Clara had a magnetism that was impossible to ignore. Toward the end of the evening, as we all drifted toward the sidewalk outside, she caught me standing quietly near the curb and asked, "Do you always hang back like a shadow, or was tonight an exception?" The teasing tone made me smile, and for the first time that evening, I found myself speaking with ease. That was the beginning of a conversation that stretched late into the night, one that ended with her slipping her number into my hand and telling me she hoped I wasn't too steady to call. Those first weeks of dating were a whirlwind, at least compared to the steady pace I was used to. Clara loved late-night drives, where we rolled down the windows and blasted music I'd never heard before. She dragged me into bookstores at midnight when they held special release parties, and she took me to food trucks that served dishes I couldn't pronounce. She had this way of making even the smallest adventure feel like a story worth telling. And though it was far from my comfort zone, I found myself saying yes more than I said no, because the way her eyes lit up when she was excited made it impossible to resist. Clara told me early on that she had dated men who bored her, men who promised stability but never challenged her spirit. She said she was tired of predictability, that life was too short for safe choices. At first I worried I might fall into that category too, but she assured me I was different. "You're steady," she said one night, "but you're not dull. You listen. You see me." At that point, I believed her completely. I thought my steadiness and her wildness could coexist in harmony, like two different colors blending into something new. Our love grew quickly, and within a year, we were talking about marriage. I proposed on a quiet autumn evening, just the two of us in a small park where leaves had turned shades of gold and crimson. Clara cried when she said yes, her voice trembling with joy, and for a moment I thought we were invincible. The months that followed were filled with planning and dreaming. She wanted a wedding that reflected both of us, and we settled on something small but vibrant. Fairy lights strung across a rustic barn, local musicians playing folk songs, and tables decorated with her handmade centerpieces. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, and it felt like the perfect way to start a life together. The early years of our marriage were everything I thought I had always wanted. We bought the house in Brookfield together, a two-story place with a creaky staircase and enough space for the family we said we would someday have. I threw myself into my work, determined to provide the kind of life that Clara deserved, while she filled the house with laughter, art, and impromptu celebrations for no reason other than to remind us life was meant to be enjoyed. She would paint while I balanced the checkbook. She would dance in the living room while I fixed a leaky faucet. In those moments, I thought we had achieved the perfect balance. But even in those early days, if I'm honest, there were warning signals I brushed aside. Clara sometimes sighed when I turned down her last-minute trip ideas, insisting we couldn't just pick up and leave without considering work schedules and budgets. She teased me about being too rigid when I insisted on sticking to plans instead of improvising. Once, after a dinner with friends where the conversation veered toward adventure and risk, she joked that she had married the safest man in the room. I laughed along with everyone else, but the comment stayed with me, a small seed of doubt I didn't want to water. Still, for the most part, our beginning felt like something beautiful, a foundation strong enough to weather anything. When people asked how we met, Clara loved to tell the story of that Italian restaurant, how I had seemed like a shadow until she pulled me into the light. She would always finish with, He might be steady, but he's mine, and he's the adventure I didn't know I needed. I held on to those words like a lifeline, repeating them in my mind whenever I worried that maybe I wasn't enough for her boundless spirit. Looking back now, I realize that the very things that drew us together were also the things that would eventually pull us apart. My steadiness was her anchor in the beginning, but over time, maybe it started to feel like a chain. Her spontaneity was my spark, but maybe I grew weary of chasing a fire that never stayed in one place. At the time, though, none of that mattered. In those first years, all I saw was a woman who had turned my world upside down in the best possible way, and all I wanted was to hold on to her, no matter what it took. What I didn't know then was that the qualities we cherished in each other at the start were also the cracks waiting to widen with time. Our beginning was full of promise, but it was also quietly laying the groundwork for the storm that would one day sweep through our marriage. The golden years of our marriage were the kind of days that made me believe we had written ourselves into the kind of love story people envied. They weren't about grand gestures or cinematic moments, but about the countless little details that stitched together a tapestry of happiness. Our mornings were simple and unremarkable, yet they felt like something sacred. I would wake before Clara, slipping out of bed quietly so she could have a few more minutes of rest, and by the time she wandered into the kitchen wrapped in her robe, the coffee was already brewed and breakfast was waiting. She would smile at me with sleepy eyes, kiss my cheek, and call me her steady rock. It was a routine, yes, but one that filled the house with warmth. Weekends were when Clara's energy truly flourished, and I gladly let myself get swept up in it. She loved to plan picnics at the nearby lakeside, where she'd pack a basket full of her favorite cheeses, fresh fruit, and a bottle of wine. We would spread out a blanket under the shade of the tall oaks, and she would sketch while I read. Sometimes she would insist on putting the book down so we could just talk about nothing and everything, about what kind of house we'd want in 10 years, about whether we would ever travel to Europe, about what names we liked for children we thought we'd one day have. Those conversations gave me hope, made me believe we were building not just a marriage but a future together, brick by brick, dream by dream. Vacations were modest but memorable. We couldn't afford luxury resorts, but Clara had a way of turning even the simplest getaway into something magical. Once, we drove 4 hours to a small coastal town where we rented a cheap bed and breakfast above a seafood shack. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the air conditioner rattled all night, but Clara made it feel like paradise. She insisted we run barefoot along the shoreline at midnight, our laughter echoing against the waves. She painted the sunrise from our balcony, gifting me the canvas afterward with the words, "For the man who makes me feel steady even when the tide pulls." That canvas hung in our bedroom for years, a constant reminder of the joy we once shared. Our friends often commented on how balanced we seemed as a couple. At dinner parties, Clara was the one filling the room with stories and laughter, while I was content to sit back, listening and chiming in at the right moments. People would say we complemented each other perfectly, that her fire needed my calm and my calm needed her fire. And in those moments, I believed them. I felt proud to be the man who could give Clara the freedom to be herself without fear of judgment. She, in turn, made me feel alive in ways I had never allowed myself before. Even in the everyday grind, our love showed itself. After a long day at work, I would come home to the smell of her cooking, pasta with homemade sauce, or her favorite rosemary chicken. We'd eat together at the kitchen table, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in deep conversation. On Friday nights, she loved to drag me into the living room for dance sessions, where she'd blast old jazz records and force me to sway awkwardly with her until I loosened up enough to laugh. Those evenings weren't about perfection. They were about presence, about letting ourselves forget the world outside for just a few hours. The holidays were another highlight. Clara adored Christmas. She would transform the house into something straight out of a catalog, with handmade ornaments, twinkling lights, and a tree that smelled of fresh pine. She insisted on baking cookies even if half of them burned, and she would rope me into helping her wrap gifts with elaborate ribbons and bows. One year, she surprised me with a handmade leather-bound journal embossed with my initials. Inside the cover, she had written, "For your thoughts, because they matter more than you think." It was such a simple gesture, yet it meant everything. It told me she saw me not just as her husband, but as a man whose inner world mattered, even if I wasn't always expressive. There was a time when I thought we were indestructible. The laughter, the intimacy, the shared dreams, it all felt too solid to ever fracture. I remember lying in bed one night, Clara curled up beside me, her head resting on my chest. She whispered, "Malcolm, I don't care where life takes us as long as we're together." In that moment, I believed her. I believed us. I thought no matter what came our way, we'd find our footing again, because our bond was stronger than anything life could throw at us. I see now that those good times weren't just the foundation of our marriage. They were also the reason it hurt so much when things began to crumble. Because we had known real joy, real connection. The pain of losing it cut deeper than if we had never experienced it at all. Those years gave me memories that still linger, bittersweet reminders of what once was and what was lost. They were the years that made me hold on longer than I should have, the years that blinded me to the signs that the tide was beginning to shift. But at the time, I wasn't looking for cracks. I wasn't anticipating storms. I was too busy being grateful for the love I thought would last a lifetime, unaware that every story, no matter how beautiful, has shadows waiting at the edges. Looking back, I can almost pinpoint the exact moments when the air between us began to shift, though at the time I brushed them off as minor ripples in the calm waters of our marriage. It started subtly, in ways that could have easily been explained away. Clara grew quieter during our evenings together, her laughter less frequent, her eyes drifting somewhere far away, even as we sat in the same room. At first, I thought she was simply tired, weighed down by the stresses of her job at the community arts center. Enrollment numbers had been dropping, funding was always a question mark, and I told myself her distracted demeanor was just her carrying that weight home with her. I even encouraged her to talk about it, but she waved me off with half-hearted smiles and assurances that everything was fine. Then there were the nights when she stayed out later than usual. Clara was always social, always surrounded by friends and colleagues who adored her, so it wasn't unusual for her to grab a drink after work or attend an art exhibit in town. But what used to be occasional outings became more frequent, and the explanations she gave began to feel thinner. "Just catching up with some people," she'd say, breezing through the door well past midnight, smelling faintly of wine and perfume, too distracted to notice the way I sat up waiting for her. I told myself not to be controlling, that she deserved her freedom, that marriages weren't meant to cage either partner. Still, a quiet unease began to gnaw at me. One evening, I suggested we plan a weekend getaway like we used to. I thought maybe we just needed to reconnect away from the routines of daily life. Clara hesitated before answering, her voice flat. "I don't think I can right now. Too much going on." I remember staring at her across the dinner table, the candlelight flickering between us, and feeling a chill in my chest. It wasn't the refusal itself. It was the indifference in her tone, as if spending time together wasn't even a priority. I tried to push the thought aside, telling myself it was just bad timing, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The physical closeness we once shared began to wane as well. Clara used to reach for my hand without thinking, curl up beside me on the couch, or brush her lips against my cheek as she passed by. But gradually, those gestures faded. She became more guarded, her touch more rare, until our bed felt less like a place of intimacy and more like two separate islands separated by a vast stretch of sheets. I noticed it, of course, but I didn't want to press. I feared that asking questions would only widen the distance, so I convinced myself it was just a temporary lull, the kind every couple experiences. Her words began to change too. She used to fill our conversations with dreams and plans, talking about the future with an enthusiasm that always inspired me. But slowly her language shifted from we to I. "I want to try this new class. I think I might travel this summer. I need to figure out what I want." They were subtle changes, easy to miss if you weren't listening closely, but I heard them. Each time, they stung like a paper cut, small, almost invisible, but painful nonetheless. There were even moments when she seemed irritated by the very steadiness she once praised. She rolled her eyes when I insisted on paying bills the same night they arrived in the mail. She sighed when I declined a spontaneous night out because of an early meeting the next morning. She laughed almost cruelly when I admitted I didn't want to take on debt for something frivolous. "You're so predictable, Malcolm," she muttered one night, and though she said it under her breath, I caught every word. Predictable. Safe. Steady. The very qualities she once called her anchor had started to sound like shackles to her. I remember one specific evening that still echoes in my memory. We had been invited to a friend's engagement party. Normally, Clara was the life of such gatherings, moving from group to group with boundless energy. But that night, she barely engaged. She stood off to the side, nursing her drink, her gaze distant. When I tried to pull her into conversation, she snapped, "Malcolm, can't you just let me breathe for once?" It was a small moment, easily dismissible as a bad mood, but it struck me like a blow. Let her breathe? Had I been suffocating her without realizing it? I told myself all marriages had seasons, that we were simply in a rough patch. I doubled down on trying to be supportive. I picked up extra chores around the house, surprised her with flowers, even tried to loosen my rigid routines to show her I could be flexible. But no matter what I did, her distance grew. She smiled less, sighed more, and I began to feel like a guest in my own marriage, tiptoeing around her moods, waiting for the woman I loved to return. Deep inside, I knew something fundamental was changing. The warmth that had once defined our relationship was cooling, replaced by a quiet frost that crept into every corner of our lives. I told myself it was temporary, that if I held on long enough, things would go back to the way they were. But the truth, though I couldn't admit it then, was that we had already begun to drift apart. The first warning signs were there, flashing like faint lights on the horizon. I just chose to ignore them, convincing myself that love and patience would be enough to steer us back on course. I didn't yet realize that those warning signs weren't just signals of trouble ahead. They were the beginning of the end. The days that followed those first warning signs became heavier, and the subtle shifts I had tried to rationalize away began to grow into undeniable cracks in the foundation of our marriage. It was as if Clara and I were living in parallel worlds under the same roof. She existed in hers, filled with new acquaintances, late nights, and a restless energy that I couldn't seem to keep up with, while I clung to the structure and predictability that had always given me a sense of peace. The gap between us was no longer something imagined. It was tangible, like a cold draft seeping into a house through broken windows. At first, I continued to convince myself that these were temporary phases, that marriages evolved and went through storms, but eventually, the signs became too glaring to dismiss. One of the clearest indicators came when she started canceling plans with me more frequently. We had always made it a point to set aside Friday evenings as our time, a ritual that kept us grounded amid busy schedules. It didn't matter if it was a simple dinner at home or a night out at a local cafe. Those evenings were sacred. But suddenly she was too tired or already committed to something else. When I asked her once what those commitments were, she brushed me off with a vague, "Just meeting up with people from work." There was an edge to her tone, a defensive sharpness that made it clear she didn't want me pressing further. I felt the sting, but instead of confronting her, I swallowed it down, afraid that pushing too hard would only widen the rift. Even our conversations began to take on a different tone, where once they had been filled with curiosity, laughter, and warmth, they now felt transactional. "Did you pay the utility bill? Can you grab groceries on your way home? I'll be out late, don't wait up." That was the bulk of our exchanges. She no longer asked about my day, no longer lingered when I shared something that excited me, no longer gave me her full attention. And I noticed that when she did talk, it was often about people I didn't know, names of colleagues, new friends from an art collective, a man named Jordan who seemed to come up more often than I would have liked. I told myself I was imagining things, that Jordan was just a coworker, nothing more, but his name gnawed at me in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. It wasn't just the emotional distance that hurt, it was the silence. Our home, once filled with music, conversation, and the hum of shared life, began to feel eerily quiet. I would come home from work and find her sitting on the balcony with her phone in hand, staring off into the distance as if waiting for a message. When I greeted her, she offered little more than a nod before retreating into her own world again. I found myself wandering the rooms aimlessly, searching for some trace of the closeness we once had, but all I found were echoes of memories that no longer matched our present reality. Then came the arguments, which seemed to flare up out of nowhere. Small things. Me forgetting to move the laundry to the dryer, her leaving dishes piled in the sink, became sparks that ignited into full-blown fights. It wasn't the content of the arguments that mattered. It was the venom behind them. Clara's words became sharper, her patience thinner, and no matter how much I tried to de-escalate, it always ended with her storming off, leaving me alone with a knot in my chest. I began to dread even the smallest interactions, afraid that anything I said might trigger another explosion. One particularly painful evening still plays vividly in my mind. I had spent the whole day preparing a surprise dinner for her, hoping to reignite a little warmth between us. I cooked her favorite meal, set the table with candles, even picked up a bottle of wine I knew she loved. When she walked through the door, I greeted her with what I hoped was enthusiasm, but the look on her face made my stomach sink. She barely glanced at the table before muttering, "Malcolm, I told you I had plans tonight." She didn't sit down, didn't touch the food, didn't even thank me for the effort. Instead, she changed clothes quickly and left again, leaving me sitting alone at a table set for two. The candles burned down to stubs as I stared at the empty chair across from me, wondering how we had gotten here. The intimacy, or lack thereof, was another glaring issue. It wasn't just that we weren't physically close anymore, it was that she seemed actively resistant. When I tried to hold her, she stiffened. When I leaned in to kiss her, she turned her face away, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask what was wrong, she exploded in frustration. "Why do you always need something from me? Can't you just let me be?" The words cut deeper than any silence could have. I wasn't asking for much, just a touch, a gesture, some sign that she still wanted to be connected to me, but in that moment, it was clear she saw even my longing as a burden. I started to notice changes in her appearance, too. Clara had always taken pride in her style, but now it was different. She dressed more boldly, spent more time getting ready to go out, and wore perfumes I hadn't smelled on her before. When I asked about it once, she laughed dismissively, saying she just wanted to feel good about herself again. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I couldn't shake the suspicion that she was dressing for someone else, not for me. The escalation wasn't just in what she did, but in what she stopped doing. She stopped saying "I love you" before bed. She stopped texting me during the day, even just to check in. She stopped including me in her world. It was as though I had become an accessory in her life, something convenient to have around but no longer central. And no matter how much I tried to pull us back together, she kept slipping further away, like sand running through my fingers. By the time I realized how serious things had become, it felt almost too late. We weren't partners anymore. We were two strangers cohabiting, orbiting the same space without ever colliding. And though I told myself I was prepared to fight for us, to hold on no matter how hard it got, there was a gnawing fear in the back of my mind, a fear that perhaps she had already made her choice, and I was the only one left clinging to the illusion of us. The breaking point of all those escalating problems finally came in a moment that I hadn't prepared myself for, though in hindsight the signs had been staring me in the face for weeks. Clara and I had just finished another silent dinner, one of those evenings where we sat across from each other, eating mechanically, without a word exchanged beyond the obligatory "pass the salt." I was tired of the tension, tired of feeling like I was the only one trying to hold together the frayed threads of our marriage, so after the plates were cleared, I asked her directly, "Clara, what's going on with us? You're not here, not really. We barely talk, we don't laugh, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger." She sighed deeply, not meeting my eyes, and for a long moment I thought she might ignore me altogether. But then she dropped the words that shattered what little hope I had left. "I need space. A month, maybe more. I can't breathe in this marriage anymore. I need to figure out who I am without you." The way she said it, calm, detached, almost rehearsed, made it sting even more. It wasn't shouted in anger, wasn't a plea in tears. It was a statement of fact, as if she had been preparing this declaration for some time. I sat frozen, trying to process it. 1,000 questions whirled through my head. Was there someone else? Was this her polite way of leaving me? Did she actually plan on coming back? Or was this just her first step toward the exit? I wanted to demand answers, but the weight of her words pressed me down into silence. I nodded, muttered something incoherent about needing time to think, and retreated into the bedroom, leaving her on the couch scrolling through her phone as though nothing monumental had just happened. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. The woman I had built a life with, the woman I had promised to love and protect, was essentially telling me she needed protection from me, that my presence was suffocating her. It was a devastating blow to my confidence, to my sense of self. I began questioning everything, whether I had been too clingy, too boring, too predictable. The weight of self-blame pressed down on me like a stone, and for the first time I truly considered that maybe our marriage was already over, and I just hadn't accepted it yet. The next day, unable to contain the turmoil inside me, I called my sister Lena. She and I had always been close, and though I hadn't shared many of the recent struggles with her, she immediately sensed the gravity in my voice. I told her everything. Clara's distance, her coldness, the request for space. There was silence on the line for a while, then Lena finally said, "Malcolm, I love you, but you can't keep ignoring what's right in front of you. She's been pulling away for months. Maybe this isn't about you being boring or not enough. Maybe it's about her making choices she doesn't want to admit to you yet." Her words hit me hard, not because I hadn't suspected the same, but because hearing it from someone else made it real. Later that week, I confided in my best friend Aaron over a beer at our usual pub. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly before speaking. "Man, I've kept quiet out of respect, but I've noticed things. She's been hanging around with that Jordan guy from her art group, right? People talk, Malcolm. I'm not saying anything for certain, but if she's asking for space, and she's already spending more time with someone else, you need to be careful. Don't put your life on hold for someone who might already have checked out." I felt a pang of anger at the mention of Jordan, but it was mixed with resignation, because deep down I had already feared that was the truth. Their words, Lena's caution, Aaron's bluntness, started to clear the fog of denial that had clouded my judgment. For so long I had clung to the idea that if I just tried harder, if I just gave more, things would return to normal. But maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe Clara's request for space wasn't about healing or rediscovery. It was about creating distance so she could live a life without me while keeping me as a safety net in the background. Despite these revelations, I tried to approach her request with good faith. I told her, "If you need a month, take it, but I can't promise things will be the same afterward. I can't put my life on pause forever." She didn't respond, didn't protest, didn't even thank me for agreeing. She simply nodded, as if she had already decided her path long before this conversation. That silence, that lack of emotion, cut deeper than any argument ever could. It felt like I was no longer part of the equation in her mind, just a placeholder she tolerated until she figured out what she wanted. As the days of her so-called space dragged on, I found myself leaning more and more on those external voices. Lena would call to check on me, reminding me to eat, to get outside, to not let myself spiral. Aaron pushed me to join him at the gym, to keep moving forward instead of drowning in despair. Even my parents, who had always adored Clara, began to gently suggest that maybe it was time to stop trying to fix what the other person clearly didn't want fixed. For the first time, I started to feel like I wasn't crazy, that my pain was valid, that I wasn't imagining the distance. Every piece of advice, every conversation with someone who cared about me began to build a new perspective inside me. I realized I had been fighting alone for far too long, carrying the weight of a marriage that was collapsing because only one of us wanted to keep it standing. Clara's demand for space, instead of being the healing pause she framed it as, became the lens through which I finally saw the truth. She had been drifting away long before she said it aloud, and maybe I had been holding on to an illusion. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it did start to plant the seeds of something else: resolve. If Clara needed space to figure herself out, I would give it to her, but I would also use that time to figure myself out. I wasn't going to sit in limbo, waiting like a loyal dog for her to return when it suited her. For once, I would consider what I wanted, what I needed, and whether I truly deserved to be treated this way. And though it was painful to admit, I already knew the answer. I deserved more than being someone's backup plan. I deserved love, loyalty, and presence. Clara's month of space might have been meant for her, but it was becoming just as much about me, and what I would choose to do when that month finally came to an end. The days following Clara's request for space were some of the loneliest I had ever endured. At first, I held on to a shred of hope that maybe this month apart would be a reset, a way for both of us to come back stronger. I told myself that she just needed air, that maybe absence would rekindle appreciation. But as the days stretched into weeks, the silence between us became more deafening than any argument we had ever had. Clara had moved out temporarily, staying with a friend from her art collective, and in that time she made almost no effort to check in. The occasional text I sent, simple things like "How are you doing?" or "Just wanted to say I hope you're okay," were often left unanswered, or met with curt replies hours later. It was clear I was no longer a priority, and that realization became heavier each day. The loneliness gnawed at me most in the evenings. Our apartment, once alive with laughter, banter, or even comfortable quiet, now felt like an empty shell. I would sit on the couch staring at the TV, not even registering what was playing, because my mind was consumed with questions. What was she doing? Who was she with? Did she even think about me? And the worst question of all, did she miss me at all? That thought lingered in my mind like a bitter taste that wouldn't fade, and the more I entertained it, the more I realized the painful truth. I missed her, but she didn't seem to miss me. One night I reached my breaking point. It was a Friday evening, one of those nights that used to be ours. I had walked past the Italian restaurant down the block earlier that day, the same one we used to frequent, and through the window I saw a couple laughing over pasta and wine, their heads leaning close together in a bubble of intimacy. The sight hit me like a punch in the gut, because once upon a time, that had been Clara and me. By the time I got home, I collapsed on the couch, tears welling in my eyes, and for the first time in years, I cried uncontrollably. It wasn't just grief over Clara, it was grief over myself, over the man I had become, a shadow clinging to scraps of affection, waiting for someone who had already turned away. That was my rock bottom. But as I sat there broken and exhausted from the tears, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't sudden, not a lightning bolt of clarity, but a slow, simmering realization that had been building for weeks and finally reached the surface. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep waiting for Clara to decide if I was worth her time. I couldn't keep holding on to a marriage that only one of us seemed to care about. That night I wiped my face, stood in front of the mirror, and told myself out loud, "You're done begging. You deserve better than this." My voice cracked as I said it, but the words rang with a finality that felt strangely liberating. The next morning, I called Lena and told her about my decision. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "If Clara doesn't want to be here, then I won't keep waiting for her." Lena didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, she sighed softly and said, "Malcolm, I'm proud of you. It's going to hurt, but choosing yourself is the only way forward." Her support was the confirmation I needed. Later that day, Aaron came by, and over a long conversation, he reminded me that sometimes endings are necessary for new beginnings. "Don't think of it as losing her," he said. "Think of it as finally making room for someone who actually wants to stay." With their encouragement, I began to take small steps toward reclaiming myself. I packed away some of Clara's things that she had left behind, not out of spite, but as a way of making space, both physically and emotionally, for my own healing. I started going to the gym with Aaron more consistently, not just to distract myself, but to remind my body and mind of strength I had forgotten I had. I reconnected with hobbies I had abandoned, like photography, wandering the city with my camera and finding beauty in places I had ignored for years. Slowly, day by day, I felt pieces of myself returning. But the most significant step came when I sat down and wrote a letter to Clara. I didn't send it, at least not right away, but I poured every ounce of honesty into it. I wrote about how much I had loved her, how much I had tried, and how deeply it hurt to watch her slip away. But I also wrote about myself, about realizing I deserved a partner who wanted to stand beside me, not someone who asked me to disappear so they could breathe. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, but my heart felt lighter. That letter was less about her and more about me, about claiming my own voice again. As the end of the month drew closer, I realized I no longer cared what decision Clara would make. At the beginning, I had been counting the days, waiting anxiously for the moment she would call or walk through the door, desperate for her to say she missed me. But by the time day 30 rolled around, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living again, fragile, but free. I had reached the point where I understood that even if she came back begging, things could never be the same. The man who sat at that candlelit dinner table weeks ago, waiting for a wife who didn't show, was gone. In his place was someone who had learned to stand alone, someone who had chosen dignity over desperation. And while I knew the road ahead would still be painful, I also knew I had already made the hardest choice. I had let go. That was the decision that changed everything. Day 31 arrived, and with it came a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I woke up early, made myself breakfast, and opened the blinds to let in the morning sun. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't dragging myself out of bed weighed down by dread or uncertainty. I wasn't counting down the hours until Clara might call or walk through the door. Instead, I focused on myself, on the peace I had begun to reclaim. I brewed a pot of coffee, turned on some music, and allowed myself to enjoy the simple rhythm of a life that was no longer dictated by waiting for someone else's decision. That was when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was Aaron or Lena checking in. But when I glanced at the screen, my breath caught. It was Clara. Her name flashing across the phone felt strange, almost foreign, as though it belonged to a chapter I had already finished reading. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice came through the line trembling, breaking in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. "Malcolm," she sobbed. I made a mistake. I thought I needed space, but I was wrong. I miss you. I miss us. Please, can we talk? Can I come home?" For a moment, the weight of her words pressed on my chest, stirring up memories of the love we once shared, the dreams we once built together. But almost immediately, another wave washed over me, one of strength, of clarity, of resolve. She was calling me on day 31, after 30 days of silence, 30 days of me drowning alone while she explored a life without me. And now, suddenly, she wanted back in. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My voice was calm, steadier than I expected. "Clara," I said softly, "I hear you, but I can't go back to the way things were. I spent this month learning that I can stand on my own. I can't just put everything behind me like nothing happened." There was silence on the other end, broken only by her muffled sobs. She tried again, pleading, "We can fix it. I promise I'll do better. I was confused. Don't throw this away." And for the first time, I realized how different things had become. I wasn't the one begging anymore. I wasn't the one holding on for dear life. I had already let go. "I'm not throwing anything away," I told her. "You did that when you walked out. I gave everything I had to this marriage, and when you asked me to disappear so you could find yourself, I did. But in that time, I found myself too. And now I know I deserve someone who doesn't need space from me to realize my worth." My words felt both heavy and freeing, as though I was finally closing a wound that had bled for too long. She begged some more, but eventually she hung up, leaving me with a quiet so profound it almost hummed. I set the phone down and sat in silence, letting the finality of it all sink in. Oddly enough, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. The tears I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt relief, as though the air around me had cleared after months of suffocation. From that day forward, I embraced my new beginning. It wasn't easy at first. I had to relearn routines that once revolved around her. I had to fill the empty spaces with new habits and new connections. But I wasn't alone. I had Lena, who called often to remind me of my worth. Aaron, who dragged me to the gym and encouraged me to push forward. And even new acquaintances I met through photography walks and weekend coffee shop visits. Slowly, my world expanded again, no longer confined to the prison of Clara's absence. I began to notice small things, the taste of coffee in the morning, the feel of the sun on my face during walks, the laughter shared with friends, that once seemed ordinary but now carried extraordinary meaning. I started capturing them through my camera, building an album of moments that told a story of survival, resilience, and rediscovery. Every photograph became proof that life was still vibrant, still worth living fully, even after heartbreak. There were still nights when memories of Clara haunted me, but they no longer controlled me. Instead of longing for what was lost, I started to reflect on what I had learned. Clara's request for space had once felt like a death sentence to our marriage, but in truth, it became a rebirth for me. It forced me to confront my dependency, to face the parts of myself I had neglected, and to understand that love should never come at the cost of self-respect. And so, when people ask me now what happened, I tell them this. Sometimes, the hardest endings are the ones that set you free. Sometimes, being abandoned is the very thing that teaches you to stand taller. I don't hate Clara. I don't even resent her anymore. In a strange way, I thank her for forcing me into a space where I had no choice but to rediscover myself. If there's one piece of wisdom I carry from all of this, it's that love is not about waiting endlessly for someone who cannot choose you wholeheartedly. Love is about presence, loyalty, and mutual respect, and when those things disappear, clinging only prolongs the inevitable. Walking away, though painful, is often the greatest act of self-love. To anyone who finds themselves in the position I was in, holding on to someone who has already left you emotionally, I say this: do not wait for day 31. Do not wait for a call that may never come. Do not measure your worth by someone else's confusion. You are enough on your own, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to choose yourself. As for me, my story didn't end with Clara's tears. It began anew with my decision to let go, to embrace the unknown, and to believe in the possibility of something better. And every morning, when I wake up and open the blinds to let in the sun, I remind myself of the truth I learned the hard way. Sometimes losing someone is exactly how you find yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.